Good evening, everyone. Good evening. This is a nice crowd. Welcome, and thank you for coming. Before we get started, turn your phones off. On behalf of the Charles Hamilton Houston Law School Preparatory Institute, we're happy that you all are here. We know it's a holiday weekend. You could be anywhere, and you've chosen to be here, so we're very happy about that. We are celebrating our 37th anniversary, which is pretty incredible. So before we bring some other people up on the stage, because we've got an exciting evening, I would like to have the CHH Scholars class of 2016 stand up and turn around so everybody can take a good look at you. Thank you. We're going to hear from a few of the students a little later. So I'm Suji Sutler. I'm the executive director of the program. I've just been here for 5 years. I haven't been here for 37 years like Donald Temple and Everett Bellamy, but I'm glad to be here, and it's been an honor to be the executive director. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dean Everett Bellamy to come to the stage and give a welcome and talk a little bit about our relationship between CHH and Georgetown Law Center. I believe that the program's been here 32 of the 37 years? Yes? 35 of the 37 years. So we're happy to have a home here. So.
Good evening.
Good evening.
The students who stood up and you had a chance to look at are the future Charles Hamilton Houstons of the world. So we know that the law and its institutions are in good shape. I'd like to welcome all of you. But first I'd like to thank Suji for the wonderful job she has done on the last 5 institutes as the executive director. Let's give her a round of applause. She works so hard all year long preparing for the Summer Institute, and it's a labor of love because the stipend she gets is modest one, as is so for all the people who teach and work for CHH. I want to take you back to the year of 1980, 36 years ago, when I arrived in Washington, D.C. into Georgetown University Law Center when I was appointed one of the deans here. And I served as a dean for 30 years, stepping down in 2010. I continued to teach as an adjunct professor. But in 1980, late 1980, I met a young attorney who was working on Capitol Hill. His name was Donald Temple. And Donald was involved in a lot of things. He started a newspaper. He made a run for Congress. He had his private practice. He started his institute in 1979 with a small group of Howard Law students. He'll tell you more about that. But he met and he changed my life, and he said, E, as he calls me, man, we ought to take the program national and base it at Georgetown. I said, sounds like a great idea to me, because I think before Donald was meeting wherever he could meet, whether it was at Howard Law School, his apartment, I don't know where he was meeting, but I agreed with the idea. And I approached the current dean here at Georgetown at the time and asked him, could we do this? Told him a little bit about the Institute. And hopefully he knew at the time about Charles Hamilton Houston. And in fact, those of you who are in the Institute this summer, make sure when you talk to people back home, ask them, do you know about Charles Hamilton Houston? A lot of people are going to say no, they never heard of the man. It's your job to educate them, okay? And so that dean at the time, the dean who hired me, said, yes, we'd love to have the Institute here. And 5 subsequent deans have all said, yes, have it here, have the full run of the facilities here at Georgetown University, the use of the library, computers, cafeteria, fitness center. Even some of the students have lived on campus. We have a student center that houses about 290 students in apartments, and some of the CHH students have lived in that facility. So Georgetown opened its doors wide and said, you are here, you're welcome to stay, and the CHH students will be treated as if they were Georgetown Law students. And that has been beautiful. And they have not received one dime. Georgetown has not received anything for use of the facilities. Some law schools have said, yeah, Bellamy, you can bring them here, but this is what you have to pay for the classroom, for parking, for use of the facilities and so forth. Not one dime has been asked for Georgetown. And in fact, recently there was a discussion about moving the institute to another law school. And the dean and the associate dean here at Georgetown said, please, Everett, don't do that, okay? We'll do whatever it takes to keep the institute here. Donald, Suja, and I discussed it, and we just said, let's continue to go with Georgetown. What's the old saying? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's been a wonderful relationship between Georgetown, one of the most prestigious law schools in the world, not just the United States, and the Charles Hamilton Houston Preparatory Law Institute. So I just wanted to share with you that background and show you how much we appreciate everyone. And I'm talking about the staff, the security guards, the people who produce the student identifications, the people at the cafeteria. You know, everyone looks forward to June when our students arrive, and they look forward to them with a smile on their face. And I'm sure those of you who are there, and then students have been in some ways will tell you how they're treated by everyone here at the Law Center. So that's just a little background on our relationship with Georgetown Law. We love it. We want to continue it. And, corporations can go on in perpetuity. That's why they're designed that way. And we don't know how long CHH will continue. We've had a wonderful 7 years, and we hope it will continue for that amount of time in the future or longer. And some of you who are now students may one day be teaching in it. So again, welcome, and you're in for a wonderful evening, so enjoy.
Good evening. Thank everyone for coming. I want to especially thank Everett. At that time, I was a graduate law student here, and we met. And like I said, time really flies. And he said 36 years. I was getting chills for that. I had to think about what that meant in terms of my chronology. But I wanted to just tell you folks a little bit about the CHH program. But Everett also said that we should talk about Charles Hamilton Houston. And one of the reasons why we named the program after Charles Hamilton Houston is because so often people do work in our communities and their legacy fades like particles of dust into oblivion. And Charlie Houston, who is a child, a progeny of the District of Columbia, was a great lawyer, and his life, which went too soon, made an incredible contribution. So his legacy is something that we should. I saw some students recently at an event, and I said, who is Charles Hamilton Houston? And they didn't know. And several of them were law students. So I think it's critical, and I'd just like to answer the question before we start. Charles Hamilton Houston was born in 1895 in September, and he died in April 1950. He was a black lawyer who helped play a major role in dismantling Jim Crow laws, and is known for his work in helping to train law students, in particular Thurgood Marshall, whom he met at Howard's Law School. He's known as the man who killed Jim Crow, and he played a role in nearly every civil rights case that went to the Supreme Court before Brown v. Board of Education, and created the legal precedent for the cases which ultimately resulted in Thurgood Marshall's brilliant advocacy in the litigation, Brown v. Board, 1955. His mission after serving in the military was to come back to the United States to attack the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal document. And then his interest was especially in the area of education, because of the different inferior education schools, inferior schools that our young people were attending. In the fall of 1919, he entered Harvard Law School, earning his Bachelor of Laws degree and his Doctorate of Laws in 1923. In 1922, he became the first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review. He later joined Howard's law faculty and established a long-standing relationship between Howard and Harvard Law Schools and was able to get Howard accredited. It was there at Howard that he became a mentor to Thurgood Marshall. Houston struck upon the idea that unequal education was the Achilles heel of Jim Crow. And by demonstrating the failure of states to even live up to the 1896 rule of separate but equal, Houston hoped to finally overturn Plessy v. Ferguson, and he did. Now CHH. In 1980, we started the program, and I should say it's instructive because coming out of Howard undergraduate and then going on to Santa Clara and then to Georgetown, the idea that I could be in law school and not understand what was happening in the class and in the readings, etc., and then having to compensate for that and then to survive and compete. When we finished law school and I came back to DC after taking the bar and starting work, I said that I would begin to make sure that Howard students in particular who were going to law school would be exposed to the rigors of the first year study of law. So we started CHH really doing lectures in an apartment on Girard Street, Northwest. And we would do tutorials for students, some Belinda Johnson, Darrell Avery, and others who have gone on to become lawyers. Our program has grown, and it is, I think, to Everett's credit and Suji and to Professor Simmons and lawyers and judges in this town who wrap their arms around the program. It is a robust 7-week program. It's a different world. It's a program where students are engaged. They are taught the Socratic method. They're given a history of the law. The first case that our students get is the reported Dred Scott case. They're taught in the first week using Statsky on case analysis how to dissect cases, an introduction to American federal court systems, how judges are appointed, selected, the differences between courts of appeals and trial courts. They're taught the civil litigation process. The first week of our program, they're introduced to the civil litigation process from the beginning, i.e. the dispute complaint all the way up to the Court of Appeals. They can walk you, any one of them can walk you through that, and they can distinguish the difference between a Rule 12 motion, Rule 56, Rule 50. They know exactly the points where motions are filed and how they're litigated so that it implicates and informs their reading of cases so they can begin to understand the cases. The program is a 100-hour, 7-week program. We instruct on civil procedure, torts, contracts, legal writing, appellate advocacy. They also write briefs and rewrite briefs and rewrite briefs. And they argue those briefs here at Georgetown, where some of you have heard some of the arguments. The best presenters actually argue before the DC Court of Appeals, before a panel of appellate judges, and occasionally a federal judge will join them. They have 3 law school exams as well. We're now in our 37th year. We started the first 5 years to Everett's credit. Everett and I taught the first 5 years, and we taught, and the program was offered for free. The tuition now is minuscule and affordable. Our graduates have attended more than 60 different law schools throughout the United States, including Howard, Georgetown, George Washington, Temple, American Catholic, William & Mary, Stanford, Columbia, University of Virginia, UCLA, Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, University of Maryland, Texas Southern, University of Florida, FAMU, Tulane, Vanderbilt, and the University of Chicago. With that, I'm going to just turn over the podium to a few of our students so that you can get a flavor personally from them in terms of their experiences. But before I do that, I do want to acknowledge the professors who are here. And their labor here is not the compensable type of labor that many people receive in the private sector. So their work is a work of love. And we teach with love. We teach with love here because that's what it takes. And we teach our students, hopefully, unlike law school, not to be competitive, but to be cooperative and to be collective. And it's important. So I want to acknowledge Professor David Simmons. As the chief judge of the court, the Human Rights Commission, he instructs and helps our young people gain exposure to clerkships, and some of our students have gone to clerk for several courts of appeals, including off the top of mine, the Ninth Circuit, and other circuits, as well as trial courts and state courts. Chanel Henry. Nancy Brown, David Harara, and Kim Keenan Blackman. And I especially wanted to thank Suji again, and young Hannah, who has been assisting, who's here working with me for the summer from Yale. Hannah, stand up. And with that, I'd like to ask Mr. Tresvant, Juan Tresvant, who's on his way to Howard's Law School, to say a few words. Thank you.
How are you all? My name is Kawan Michael Tresvant. I'm an incoming 1L at Howard University. I went to undergrad at Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. And that's my intro. So the CHH program is essentially very beneficial to us because not only does it reduce the shock value that the first year law school has, but essentially like Professor Temple was talking about, we're gonna slide that one under the rug. Like Professor Temple was talking about, it allows us to become a part of the Charles Hamilton Houston legacy. And essentially with that, we get, it gives us the intellectual curiosity to delve deeper into what other African American or colored folk have done to pave the way for us and build a bridge so that we can get to where we are and hopefully one day surpass them and make it easier for the next generation to do what we're doing today. I was trying to keep it short and sweet, so there you guys go.
Elijah Porter from Atlanta, Georgia.
Anything worth having is worth fighting for. And so, since we became a part of this CHH family, we've learned how to fight, okay? You start to see that the law is a constant battle. Okay, the plaintiff files the complaint, the defendant answers, and you start to just go through a series of stages in your evolution. And so somewhere along the way, you get knocked out. You get knocked out. And that's how it is being in Professor Temple's class. That's how it is being in Professor Keenan's class, and any of these professors, because it's a learning process. But the key to success is preparation. And so sometimes when you do, face those knockouts, you can bounce back. My name is Elijah Porter. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, the one and only. And I'm a graduate of Fort Valley State University, headed to Howard Law School. This experience here at CHH has been phenomenal. I got a family from all over the world. I love them to death. We can call each other for anything. Did you read that brief? Did you not? Did you read that case? So it has truly just been an amazing experience, and I just look forward to this journey into law school. It's such a blessing to really be here at CHH. Thank you.
Today is Elijah's birthday as well.
Sidoni Becton.
Good evening, distinguished guests, CHH professors, alumni, scholars, and friends. As Professor Temple said, my name is Sidoni Becton, and I graduated from CHH 2 years ago. This fall, I will be a 3L at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law in Baltimore. While I am extremely blessed to work as a summer associate in one of the largest law firms in Montgomery County, Maryland this summer, it has been a long road to get here. And the influence the CHH program had and continues to have on my legal career is truly invaluable. In the time I have, I would like to share 2 lessons I learned as a CHH scholar. Number 1, the importance of working for something greater than yourself, and 2, the importance of perseverance. From the orientation through the graduation ceremony, the professors impressed upon us the importance of the following quote from Charles Hamilton Houston, and I'm sure you all have heard it already. A lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. While this quote was important during the program, I definitely saw its importance last spring, following the death of Freddie Gray. I watched from my apartment window as the city was in chaos, all while helping colleagues in my law school come up with ways to take a stand against police brutality in the Black community. Following the peaceful protests and riots in Baltimore, it became even more critical to get involved in local bar associations and my school's chapter of the Black Law Students Association in order to contribute to the discussions on how we would allow this tragedy to impact the legal system. As a result, I planned the Bolsa Chapter's annual banquet entitled The Fierce Urgency of Now, Race Relations in the 21st Century, where we honored the Honorable William Billy Murphy, attorney for the Gray family, as he is an alumni of the Maryland School of Law. I also became involved in my school's clinical law program, which provides legal services to those who otherwise would not be able to afford it. I truly learned the importance of being a social engineer. Additionally, CHH taught me to accomplish tasks against all odds. As Professor Temple mentioned, the first assignment from him was to read the 200-plus page opinion on Dred Scott. As students, we wondered what the point of this assignment was and why we had to stay up so late to finish readings and writing papers. It was not until things became a bit more challenging my first semester at Maryland Law that I realized the purpose of these assignments, at least for me, was to teach perseverance. This lesson continues to influence me today. Many people told me that I would not land a job with a big law firm if I was not in the top 5% of my class after 1L year. I did not let their opinions dissuade me and applied anyway, and I am now enjoying my time as a summer associate at a law firm. Unfortunately, this past semester I also learned one of the toughest lessons students experience, that life does not stop just because you are in law school. I had a death in my family right around the time that classes ended and just before finals. But remembering the long nights and the accomplishments I had while in CHH helped keep me grounded and not to lose focus. I am proud to say that this was not only the toughest semester, but the best semester grade-wise thus far. Moving forward, I truly know that my experiences with CHH will continue to impact the choices I make in my legal career. So in conclusion, I would like to speak directly to the CHH scholars. As I'm sure you have already realized, this summer will not be easy. But remember, you can only get out of the program what you put into it. I challenge you not to become complacent in the fact that this program is not a required program. Demand of yourself that you work harder than you ever have, and you will leave this program better prepared than any of your 1L classmates. This is your time to learn the proper skills that will make you successful in law school. In CHH, you are surrounded by faculty who want to see you do nothing but succeed. This positivity is something you will always remember. I leave you with the following mantra that I tell myself every day. Scholars, please repeat after me. No matter how bad it is, no matter how bad it gets, I am going to make it. Thank you for your time, and to the CHH administrators for inviting me to speak this evening.
And lastly, gentleman who finished the program last year, Stephen Ford, who's at the University of Chicago.
Good evening. My name is Stephen Ford. I graduated last year from the program. Just finished my first year at the University of Chicago Law School. And Judge Simmons, I think, I'm not sure if the sweat from your first cold call has evaporated from that classroom up there. So, I'll just be very brief. CHH has been a tremendous program for me, and it has had a tremendous impact on my law school experience. It's been an excellent preparation for the rigors, specifically the mental rigors of law school. It's been excellent exposure to phenomenal people, phenomenal mentors, phenomenal people who are invested and care deeply about you. But my biggest takeaway from CHH's program was that CHH gave me armor. And armor is something that no one else can take from you if you build it up the right way through hard work and sweat. And for me, the armor that I received from my professors allowed me to engage my classmates and sometimes my professors in tough conversations in crim law. It allowed me to stand up, it's lumbar support, allowed me to stand up a little bit taller in a world that can sometimes be hostile to you because of your aspirations and your dreams, which should always be big. But CHA's taught me that a fight for justice, a fight that's worthy of the people that came before us, doesn't always have to be loud, but it can be pursued through excellence. And the fight for justice begins today. It does not begin tomorrow. It does not begin in law school. You need to dot every I, cross every T, and make sure that you are excellence personified in everything that you do, because that world out there demands it. I will be honest, this program was tough. Law school was tough. I've never talked to Jesus more in my life, nor my grandma. But I will leave you guys with two things. And it was one question that I called my grandma after Judge Simmons' class, that first class. And she had one statement and one question. The statement was, I said, "Grandma, this is tough." And she said, I know it's tough. She said, but you can't lead the flock if you don't walk through the fire first. And the hard work that sometimes seems disconnected, it seems like you can't get through sometimes, this is for a reason. And you are preparing to be leaders in our community. You are preparing to do things that are worthy of all the people in this room and for our people. But the question she asked me was, are you different than you were yesterday? And I said, no, I don't think I am. And she says, then you're not working hard enough. Because every step that you take, every next level that you try to get to, she told me, you need to be a different version of yourself, an evolved version of yourself. And after going through and finishing and completing my first year of law school, I am eternally grateful to, I see some of my professors, but to Mr. Temple and Dean Bellamy and Ms. Sutler in particular, for allowing me to be part of this program and allowing me to be a part of the community. So I'll be brief, but thank you so much.
Now for the moment that everyone has been waiting for. Thank God for Nkechi Taifa. It's a great pleasure to introduce my friend, my fellow Howard University alum, Go Bison, and soldier in this struggle for human rights, human dignity, equal rights, and for social empowerment. It's a privilege that our history is what it is, and that she comes here today to speak with the students of CHH. She follows last year's speaker, who was William Murphy from Baltimore, and prior to that it was Judge Damon Keith. Prior to that it was late Jackie Berrien, who is the former EEOC commissioner, who was a CHH graduate. And before that it was the Honorable Inez Smith-Reed from our Court of Appeals. Nkechi is the proud mother of a daughter, Mariama Taifa Setu, and the wife of Dakari James, who is present. Dakari James Kearney. She received her Juris Doctorate from George Washington University and graduated magna cum laude from Howard University. She's admitted to practice before the United States Court of Appeals for DC, and the District of Columbia. She serves presently as the Advocacy Director for Criminal Justice for Open Societies Foundation and Open Society Policy Center, and also convenes the Justice Roundtable, a broad network of advocacy groups advancing federal criminal justice policy in Washington, D.C. She's a founding director of the Equal Justice Program at Howard University's Law School, where she also directed the law school's externship program and taught seminars on racial disparity in criminal justice and public interest law and the law, corrections, and prisoners' rights. I read this because I think that people need to know who she is. So, Nkechi, you can come up. And she's also served as a legislative counsel for the ACLU and worked the Women's Legal Defense Fund and the National Prison Project. But she served as well as an elementary school teacher. To her credit, she's published 5 law review articles, and one of them is on integrative solutions to interrelated issues, a multi-functional look behind the cycle of incarceration. She's an author of the groundbreaking article, Roadblock Reentry to Prison After Imprisonment. And she's written a number of books, including children's books, and received a number of awards, a few which are worth mentioning in Nkechi. The Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Award, the President's Award from the Washington Council of Lawyers, the Marcus Garvey Award from the United Negro Improvement Association, the Rose Marion Award for Excellence in Teaching and Service, Outstanding Social Engineer Award, and Distinguished Faculty Award, all from the Howard University School of Law. But more importantly, I've had an opportunity to work with Nkechi. We've been colleagues and comrades over more than 30 years. She represents the fire that burns in the heart and through the mind and the soul of Black folk. She's intelligent, she's passionate, she's compassionate, she's nationalistic, Pan-Africanistic, humanitarian, courageous, creative, and elegant. She writes, she thinks, she serves, and she gives back. And she gives back, and she gives back. She's a selfless, priceless embodiment of activism for our cause. And we're honored, Nkechi, that you took time to be with us. Thank you.
On human rights, just someone to sit right there. It's like I got a flustered there. I said to Professor Suji, he's not gonna read all that, is he? Oh my goodness gracious. Donald, thank you so very much. I want to really give a shout out to you, Donald Temple, visionary founder of the Charles Hamilton Houston Preparatory Law Institute, Judge David Simmons, Dean Everett Bellamy, all of whom have inspired and guided me throughout the years, to which I have much to be grateful. Donald, one of the most creative people, one of the most creative people's lawyers that I have known, full of ideas, full of solutions, a true genius, and a legal trailblazer. Judge Simmons, Judge David Simmons, a brilliant jurist who's made my tenure when I was chair of the DC Commission on Human Rights a breeze, and who always had my back. And Dean Bellamy, quiet and unassuming, who I've always admired from afar, who opened the doors of Georgetown Law School's faculty lounge to meetings of the National Conference of Black Lawyers way back in the day. Ron Isaac, I know you remember those days. These are the stalwarts of the Charles Hamilton Houston Preparatory Law Institute. But they would be unable to do what they do without the tireless and tenacious work of Executive Director Suji Sutler. So again, thank you for allowing me to be here with you this evening and share just a few words. So CHH scholars, my whole career, I have practiced law in the public interest. And people often ask me, just what is it that shaped and molded you into the lawyer that you are today? So I hope with this presentation to share just a little of this with you, in the hope that it inspires you to either pick up the baton of the public interest movement or people's lawyer, or to support those who do. So I was born at the end of the year 1954, and this was the year of the legendary Brown versus Board of Education decision. It was 1 year before Rosa Parks defied the laws of this land and was ingraciously jailed. It was also 1 year before the body of Chicago's 14-year-old Emmett Till was found at the bottom of Mississippi's Tallahatchie River. 8 years before the indomitable Fannie Lou Hamer determined to register to vote. And each of these events involved the law, and each left deep imprints upon my soul. So where does the love to practice public interest law come from? Is it in the blood, intrinsic and ancestral? Is it molded and shaped from conditions and circumstances? Does it occur by chance? But for me, the spark came during the late 60s. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. Why? Now don't laugh, ladies. But there was this poster tacked to the bulletin board of my 8th grade Black Studies classroom of a black man with a black beret on his head, and he had a rifle in one hand and he had a spear in the other. He was sitting in this Grand Slam wicker chair. And all the teenage girls in my class were buzzing about how fine this brother was. And I, however, kept wondering why he was in jail. And even more importantly, why was the head of the Black Panther Party being represented by a white lawyer? Granted, he was a progressive lawyer, a radical lawyer, a movement lawyer, but where were the black lawyers to represent the black people, I wondered? Where were the black lawyers, Donald, to represent the black people? Injustice has always impacted me deeply. And around the same time, I remember riding in the car with my parents right after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968. And while we were riding, the windows were tightly rolled up, even though it was not a cold day, it was in April, because of all of the unrest and the uncertainty that was around. And as we drove down 14th Street, which was one of the hardest hit corridors in Washington, D.C., I was totally shocked. I mean, the scene appeared to have come straight from the battlefields of Vietnam. The army was out there with guns and with masks. The community looked war-torn, with store windows smashed in and the trash from the looted goods strewn all over the streets. And every single business had a sign up with the word smeared on the window, "Soul Brother." Even Jewish and Asian brothers, you remember Soul Brother. Why? Because just as in the Bible, where the houses were passed over, if blood was smeared on the door, businesses owned by black people would likewise be spared from destruction. And around age 15 or 16, I remember every single week, adorned in my tight bell-bottom jeans with platform-stacked heels, mid-riff tube top, it's a long time ago, huge towering African gele, hair wrap on my head, long dangling imitation gold hoop earrings, racing to catch the bus downtown, down Georgia Avenue, past Howard University to the Black Panther office, which at that time was a storefront located at 1610 7th Street Northwest next to the Southern Dining Room. And the brothers and sisters were carrying on PE, they called it political education classes, in the larger back area. And I usually, however, stayed in the front office, sitting on the lap of this cute brother named T, who was pulling security. And every Saturday, I used to meet the brothers and sisters downtown in front of Soul Shack Record Store on 13th and F and help to sell the Black Panther Party newspaper. I remember the 1969 murder of Chicago Black Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in their beds, and the lies and the fabrications of the police department afterwards to cover up their assassination. You see, over 45 years ago, I knew about the Panthers because they made the front page news. But I did not know about the horrific Dred Scott case where a U.S. Supreme Court justice stated what? That a black person in America had no rights, which a white person was bound to respect. You see, 45 years ago, I didn't know about the 1822 trial of freedom fighter Dingmark Vesey, who masterminded one of the most elaborate slave insurrections in history. I didn't know about the case, libelants and claimants of the schooner Amistad, where in 1841 international law was applied in a domestic court in the United States and served as a springboard to free escaped Africans, kidnapped Africans. I knew nothing of the trumped-up court trial of the Honorable Marcus Garvey or the inflammatory case of the Scottsboro Boys. And I surely had never, ever heard of the phenomenal Charles Hamilton Houston and his cautionary note that if a black lawyer was not a social engineer, he was nothing but what? A parasite on society. But in high school, and college, I did study about and learn, and I lived through the cases of the Wilmington 10 who were framed for the bombing of a grocery store in Wilmington, North Carolina. The case of the RNA 11 who in 1971 were herded through the streets of Jackson, Mississippi, half naked, barefoot, and in chains for exercising self-defense after their official residence was attacked. The Attica brothers case where a prison in upstate New York erupted because the state refused to provide prisoners with basic human needs and then turned around and murdered not only the prisoners, but the hostages as well. The case of Angela Davis with her characteristic huge afro and clenched fist. But rather than being fascinated by the allure of Angela, I was mesmerized by the person she was in love with, George Jackson, and his writings, prison letters of George Jackson, Soul Dad, Brother, Blood in My Eye. You know, I was curious by what possessed his 17-year-old brother Jonathan on August 7, 1970 to bust into the Marion County courthouse with shotguns and rifles that had been purchased by Angela legally and pronounced, "All right, gentlemen, I'm taking over now," and the massacre that occurred afterwards. I was touched by Ruchell McGee, who hardly no one remembers today. Ruchell, a prisoner who just happened to be in the courtroom that day as a witness in a trial. Ruchell, the sole survivor of the August 7th courthouse massacre. Ruchell McGee, who is still languishing in prison in California today. He is nearing the 60-year incarceration mark behind bars. These were the days when we as students immersed ourselves, David, you remember, in issues involving the divestiture of corporations doing business with apartheid South Africa and trying to educate actors and athletes to support the cultural boycott of South Africa. This was a time of repressive law enforcement legislation in D.C., such as no knock, when the police could virtually knock down your door without a warrant. And it was the time of the FBI's once secret counterintelligence program, codenamed COINTELPRO, against the black movement, targeting people from Martin Luther King to Stokely Carmichael to Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, the Black Panther Party, to name just a few, in the FBI's own words. The purpose of the COINTELPRO was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize the activities of black nationalist organizations and groupings and their leadership, their spokesmen, their membership, and their supporters. We didn't really rap in those days, but permit me to share just a brief excerpt from a piece I penned and often recited back in the day. It's been a long time. COINTEL's got blacks in jail, they open up our mail, tap our phones and kick our bones and railroad us to jails. COINTEL's got blacks in jail, they open up our mail, tap our phones and kick our bones and railroad us to jail. Angela Davis, Reverend Ben Chavin, Sasada and Geronimo too, Ruchell McGee all wanted to be free from you know who. FBI went so low they invented COINTELPRO to stop the rising fire of a black messiah who could unify and electrify black people to revolutionize. Co is for counter, which means to use against. Intel is for intelligence. Pro is for program. They thought it was the perfect solution, counterintelligence program to crush the revolution. Geronimo G. Jaga Pratt was in prison during this time, a former officer with the Black Panther Party. One of the main reasons he was in prison was because he could not provide an alibi his whereabouts at the time a woman was being murdered on a tennis court in Santa Monica, California. But you know what? He had an alibi, a stone solid alibi. He was attending a Black Panther meeting at the time, over 200 miles away. But that didn't come up in court. Because of COINTELPRO, the Panthers were at each other's necks, at each other's throats. Huey Newton ordered that no one assist him in his trial. But even more sinister was the fact that the government itself knew and could prove that Geronimo did not commit the Santa Monica tennis court murder. Yet the FBI refused to provide that evidence to the defense. You see, because of COINTELPRO, wiretaps were made and kept up all meetings of the Black Panther Party, and the meeting Geronimo was at on that fateful day was no exception. But it took a judge, Judge Walter Dickey, nearly 30 years later, a judge who may have been a child or a teenager at the time of Geronimo's first trial during the early 70s, to finally look at all the evidence and finally set him free. While in college, I worked on the Legal Defense Fund and became chairperson of the National Committee to Free the RNA 11. 11 men and women, one of whom was only 15 years old at the time, who were part of a group calling itself the Republic of New Africa, which advocated for the creation of an independent Black nation in the South. Professors such as Derek Bell and James Turner were on the letterhead of the Defense Committee. Congresspersons such as then Congressman Von Dellums and Charles Diggs and John Conyers. There were ministers, cultural icons, and the list goes on. All of them lent their names and their support to free this group of political prisoners. And while working on the legal defense, I visited some of the most notorious prisons in the United States at the time, including the infamous Marion Federal Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kentucky. I met with Mario Bedelli, one of the leading defendants in the case, who after his release from imprisonment went on to receive a PhD and later became a professor. I met with Sundiata Acoli in prison since 1973, when the car he and Assata Shakur and Zayd Malik were traveling was stopped after being racially profiled on the New Jersey Turnpike. I was in the prison with the legendary Rafael Cancel Miranda, one of the 5 Puerto Rican nationalists who was convicted back in the 1950s of shooting up the House of Representatives in protest of U.S. policy in Puerto Rico, whose sentence was later commuted by President Jimmy Carter, and Leonard Peltier, the Native American who still languishes in prison today. And while in law school, of course, I joined BALSA, the Black Law Students Association, and I began to ponder the intellectual challenges, how to stimulate the ability to invent new ways by which the law can address the wide variety of substantive issues facing today's society. And what was needed, I surmise, Donald, were strong, innovative lawyers like Donald Temple, who were not afraid to think outside the box and push the envelope to achieve change. I knew I would not be a lawyer who would be chained to a desk because I nurtured a penchant for the cutting edge. And as an inspiring lawyer, I felt the responsibility to use the research, writing, and advocacy skills I was learning to challenge injustice. In the course of confronting injustice, I have been arrested 3 times. The first in front of the South African embassy in protest of continuing apartheid. I don't know if you were there at that time. This was like 83, 84 or something. The second in front of the Longworth House office building in support of statehood. Yeah, statehood for the District of Columbia. And the third in Lafayette Square across the street from the White House in support of restoring democracy to Haiti. Each time, the arrests were en masse and staged, the organizers having negotiated with the police and prosecuting authorities in advance of the demonstrations, making sure that plastic cuffs would be used and all the charges would be dropped. And after each dismissal, I gave not a second thought about the arrest, and I went on with my life with the inconvenience of maybe several hours until processing was completed. But let me be perfectly clear. My staged arrests and momentary deprivations of liberty were a far cry from the terror, dogs, fire hoses, and nooses of yesterday. I could engage in those struggles because my predecessors were on the front lines, the frontline battlefields of justice, and they sacrificed, and they struggled, and they paid the price for a new generation to pick up the baton and struggle against new manifestations of injustice. Thank you, Black Lives Matter, Movement for Black Lives, and the new generation of freedom fighters today for picking up that baton and continuing the struggle. And I thank the legendary Congressman John Lewis. I mean, it just brought a smile to my face last week when I saw them sit down in the House of Representatives where the streets were meeting the suites. The streets were meeting the suites, okay? That just brought, to my heart. I've done a lot over the years and often wondered just what my niche would be, John Britton. Would it be education and youth like Suji? Would it be employment discrimination like Professor Simmons? Would it be police brutality like Donald Temple? Would it be academia like Everett Bellamy? It ended up being criminal justice for decades of thankless, unpopular, and misunderstood error. As a staff attorney for the ACLU's National Prison Project during the mid-'80s, I often cited in my conditions of confinement briefs Chief Judge Warren's notable 1957 quote in the case of Trop versus Dulles. In this statement heralded the importance of considering, and the quote is, the evolving standards of justice, the evolving standards of decency, that mark the progress of a maturing society. The evolving standards of decency. And during the height of the war on drugs, unnecessarily long sentences were robotically meted out with seemingly callous abandon. Shocking punishments over the past 30 years of 10, 20, 30 years, life in prison without parole for drug offenses were commonplace. Such punishments should offend society's standard of decency. It should impact, it should offend our society's standards of decency, but they have not. In 1991, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Harmelin versus Michigan that mandatory life imprisonment for a first-time drug offense did not violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Because although the punishments were cruel, they were not unusual. It sounded ludicrous, and it left me flabbergasted. And the twisted rationale reminded me of the case of McCleskey versus Kemp a couple of years later, 1987. There, the court declined to provide relief in a death penalty case despite overwhelming evidence of racial bias, because the judges feared that the floodgates would be open to widespread racial challenges in other parts of criminal sentencing if they were to rule in McCleskey's favor. So lengthy sentences are cruel, but they are usual. Systemic racism exists, but that is the norm. Chattel slavery was cruel and usual, yet it was overturned. Jim Crow was cruel and usual, yet statutes were overturned. Lengthy sentences for drug offenses are likewise cruel and usual and are meted out disproportionately to people of color. They must also be eradicated. Fortunately, there is national attention today to issues involving criminal justice. And this represents an unprecedented opportunity to undertake a re-examination of the U.S. system of mass incarceration and an examination of the system of enslavement, which, as Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Institute tells us, did not end in 1865, but evolved into a legacy that can be seen in the presumption of guilt and dangerousness assigned to African Americans, which has led to mass incarceration. An examination of the system where nearly half of the total U.S. prison and jail population of over 2 million people is African American. An examination of the system where African American men in the United States are incarcerated at a rate 5 times higher than blacks were in apartheid South Africa. An examination of the system where the increase in the prison population has not been evidence of rising crime, and it's not an evidence of more criminal activity by African Americans, but it is a reflection of more stringent sentencing policies. An examination of the system wherein youth of color are overrepresented at every single stage from intake to secure confinement, with disparities increasing at each successive stage, and in which discipline begins as early as preschool, with black children 3 times more likely to be suspended, expelled, and arrested than white children. An examination of the system where 80% of girls and nearly half of all children sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole have been physically abused, with 77% of girls and 20% of all youth lifers revealing that they have been sexually abused. We need to examine the system, which has zero tolerance policies and suspends children for infractions such as talking back to teachers, truancy, horseplay, uniform violations, or other disobedient or uncooperative behavior. An examination of the system that allowed 15% of the black population of a little town called Tulia, Texas, to be arrested, convicted, and imprisoned on drug trafficking charges based on the sole uncorroborated testimony of a federally funded burn drug task force white undercover officer with a racist background whose modus operandi was to record purported drug buys on his arms and on his legs. And speaking of drugs, nothing has contributed more to the mass incarceration of people of color than the war on drugs. Is this ranting and raving? Absolutely not. A police supervisor once said that there's as much drugs in the Sears Tower and in the stock exchange as there is in the black community. But those guys are just harder to catch. Those deals are done in the office building, in somebody's home. But the guy standing on the corner, he's almost got a sign on his back. Those guys are just arrestable. So what happens? Instead of deploying officers and long-term arrest of suppliers that after 3 months may only result in the arrest of Charlie and Harry, the decision is made to deploy those same officers to the black community, to Tyrone standing on the corner, and make 200 arrests. Despite the fact that arresting those 2 guys in the suburbs may have shut down 5 or 6 crack houses, what do the police and politicians say? What do they say? They say that they're responding, Donald, to my elderly neighbor, Miss Pearl, who lived on the corner where I used to live. They say that they came to the community in full militarized force because she would call them and she expected that. And they say that she wanted them to immediately make those 200 arrests in her community, that she didn't want to hear about any 2-month-long investigation. And so I pondered, why did Miss Pearl not want to hear about it? Is it because the correct message had not reached her? Is it because she had been inundated and captivated by erroneous media depictions? And because the media did not focus on it, she didn't know that those 2 arrests would have shut down the crack houses in her community. You see, Miss Pearl and many of us did not understand just what a mandatory minimum sentence was. That it didn't matter if college student Kimber Smith got caught up with the wrong guy and he beat her and threatened her and her family so bad that she was scared to come forward about his drug dealing. It didn't matter that she is pregnant when thrown in prison. It didn't matter that she never used or handled any drugs. The mandatory minimum drug law said that she had to serve time, 24 and a half years of it. There are no mitigating or extenuating circumstances when it comes to mandatory minimum sentences. You see, back in the day, Miss Pearl didn't understand what the infamous 100-to-1 ratio meant, that the boys in the hood who were convicted of selling 5 grams of crack cocaine, the weight of a couple of packs of sugar worth past $125, received a mandatory prison term of 5 years, whereas it took 500 grams of powder cocaine, worth nearly $50,000, to get the same 5-year sentence. She didn't know that 1/3 of all federal cocaine cases involved an average weight of just 52 grams, the weight of an ordinary candy bar. She didn't understand that Tyrone was not a major drug kingpin and that the federal government had no business in his prosecution. And she didn't know that the building of prison beds was predicated upon the test scores of black boys in the 3rd grade. And guess what? Ms. Pearl never stopped to think of the impact on political empowerment in the black community as a result of 250,000 African American men being disenfranchised as a result of their felony conviction, stripped of the right to vote. Indeed, she didn't realize that every single social issue was impacted, exacerbated, and or magnified once one is released from prison. She was ignorant of the termination of parental rights under the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, the loss of school loans under the 1998 Higher Education Act amendments. She didn't know that her grandma could have been kicked out of public housing as a result of her grandson could have been kicked out of public housing as a result of his drug conviction, that her daughter could be denied public assistance, or her son unable to find employment because of the infamous box. Have you ever been convicted of a crime? Indeed, it never dawned upon her that a juvenile justice youth could be sent to Harvard for the cost of what society pays for his incarceration. Now, Ms. Pearl knew about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery, but she was unaware, Dara, of the prison slavery exception clause. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist except as punishment for a crime. So during the height of the war on drugs, with mandatory minimum sentences firmly in vogue, shocking punishments, 10, 20, 30 years, life, were normalized and hardly raised an eyebrow. But these commonplace sentences snatched mothers from children, men from loved ones, and furthered the destabilization of families and communities. Ms. Pearl didn't know about the short and long-term trauma experienced by over 2.7 million children with a parent in prison. And she didn't realize that the mere presence of school resource officers in her granddaughter's school leads to a spike in arrests in schools, that schools with them had nearly 5 times the arrests as schools without. But one thing Ms. Pearl was clear on: for impoverished communities disproportionately impacted by policing, incarceration, and violent crime, that public safety requires meaningful employment, fair and affordable housing, and adequate public educational opportunities. Finally, Ms. Pearl did not realize that year after year, decade after decade, century after century, although the players change and the scene shifts, the script irrefutably remains the same: unequal justice. Doesn't matter whether the issue is vigilantism or police brutality, prosecutorial abuse, or unjust sentencing, that as a race, black people have been subjected to a double standard of justice. The names, the groups, the events spanning the decades are legion: Eleanor Bumpurs, Michael Stewart, Amadou Diallo, Abner Louima, Johnny Gamage, Troy Davis, Oscar Grant, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Ayanna Jones, Freddie Gray, Rekia Boyd, Sandra Bland. Ms. Pearl thought what was happening with the police was justice, where in actuality it was just us. The United States today holds the dubious distinction of having the highest incarceration rate in the world, with over 2 million people behind bars, a 500% increase over the past 30 years. A primary driver of this shameful statistic is the disproportionate representation and unequal treatment faced by blacks at each stage of the criminal punishment continuum, including stops and arrests premised on racially biased profiling, police misconduct and brutality, abuse of prosecutorial discretion in charging decisions, constitutionally questionable and burdensome fees, fines, and bail policies, a skewed system of plea bargaining, lack of diversity in jury pools, improper use of peremptory challenges to remove blacks from juries, harsh, rigid, long, mandatory minimum sentences, racial application of the death penalty, legalized discriminatory treatment in employment, education, housing, public benefits, and a franchise based on one's former felony status. I spent over 30 years working on criminal justice reform issues. During the early 90s, I remember walking the halls of Congress, lobbying against the various crime bills, which culminated in what I unaffectionately call the granddaddy of all crime bills, the Crime Bill of 1994. This bill featured the largest expansion of the death penalty in modern times. It featured the trying of 13-year-olds as adults, the gutting of Pell educational grants for prisoners, the implementation of the federal 3 strikes law, the refusal to address the crack powder disparity, slews of new mandatory minimum sentences, and monetary incentives, money for states to lock up more and more people for longer periods of time in exchange for loads of money to build more prisons. And when the bill passed, there was this news item that happened to catch my eye. It stated that there was this prominent securities analyst in Virginia who spent a weekend combing through every single detail of that federal crime bill and watching the debate on C-SPAN. And he then came up with what he called a list of theme stocks for the 1990s. And what do you think his highest recommendation went to? It was none other than the Corrections Corporation of America, which at that time was the nation's most successful operator of private prisons, whose stock had recently hit an all-time high. In fact, CCA's chief financial officer was quoted as saying, "The crime bill was very favorable to us." I was shocked. Why? Because it smacked me in the face that we have a situation where the deprivation of liberty is powered in large part by the profit motive. We have a situation where there are economic interests in keeping sentences harsh and long so that prison populations continue to soar. And the scary thing about it all is that we have a situation wherein prison business may seek to maintain high occupancy rates even in the absence of demonstrated need. I'm going to repeat that. Prison business may seek to maintain high occupancy rates, even in the absence of demonstrated need. You see, from a management point of view, a prison can be characterized like a hotel or a motel. You want to fill every bed every night, and if you don't have enough guests, you do whatever you can to get them, including supporting campaigns and lobbying for mandatory and longer sentences. We're talking about a perverse profit incentive to arrest more people, convict more people, incarcerate more people, and for longer periods of time. And it starts with the presence of police officers in our schools, known as school resource officers, a seemingly benign title, but don't get it twisted. These are cops. And they simply have no business in our schools. They are the first step down the slippery school to prison pipeline slope. And the out of control growth of the federal prison population is forcing cuts in education, job training, and other social services, the very programs that address the root causes of crime. So it's not surprising that we see the advent of more and more punitive criminal punishment laws, which have caused the rate of incarceration of black folk to astronomically rise. And although the laws today are facially neutral and do not intentionally discriminate, most of them, disparate treatment is often ingrained within the structural fabric of social institutions, allowing discrimination to occur without the need for action by a specific person. You see, today's racism is often subtle and structurally embedded in many police departments, prosecutorial officers, and courtrooms. It's found in laws that look fair, but that nevertheless have a racially discriminatory impact. Policies and practices reflect this subtle and insidious racism. I want to give an example. In 1987, there was this former Philadelphia DA, Jack McMahon, who developed a training video, Judge Simmons, on how to select a jury. And in the tape, McMahon, who was an assistant DA at the time, he directed his rookie prosecutors to circumvent the law by denying certain citizens the chance to serve on a jury while favoring others. And I'm quoting, he said, "The only way to do your best is to get jurors that are as unfair and more likely to convict than anybody else in this room. That's on the training video. He taught that jurors who were especially quote unquote bad included ladies, young black women, and low-income blacks. Prosecutors had to kick them off juries, he said, without the appearance of violating the law. And you know what? Appearances mattered, because we as lawyers know in 1986, in an attempt to introduce more fairness in the criminal justice system, the Supreme Court ruled that lawyers could no longer strike potential jurors because of their race. And although McMahon was only one prosecutor in one city, his jury selection training methods were institutionalized throughout his office, and according to him were accepted principles representative of practices, quote, of the wisdom of the ages. So regardless of whether they disagreed with his approach, new prosecutors could be out of a job if they failed to follow the cultural norms. McMahon's tactics were not isolated to the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. Racism was structurally embedded in prosecutorial offices throughout the country, possibly impacting the outcome of countless cases. The long-range implications of what is increasingly becoming what Chauncey McIntyre characterized as the criminalization of a race are shuddering. Massive incarceration with lengthy sentences invariably results in the disruption and disintegration of families, destabilization of communities, and diminished life prospects. Measures which combine to incarcerate generations, resulting in incalculable damages. Any consideration of the impact of mass incarceration that fails to take into account the role of institutionalized racism is an insufficient analysis. And any remedy that does not acknowledge the understanding that racism manifests in various forms is deficient. It is past time that we confront the disastrous policies of the past half-century. This country's mammoth experiment in mass incarceration has been an abysmal failure. Kudos to Michelle Alexander. The analogy of today's system of mass incarceration with earlier systems of social control such as Jim Crow. Yes, we are talking about the institutionalization of second-class citizenship once one is released from imprisonment. Yes, we are talking about disparate treatment and profiling, arrests, and sentencing, but we may also be talking about the possible extermination of generations as well. Unfortunately, my elderly neighbor, Dakari, Miss Pearl, passed before I could tell her about my work and the successful passage of the Second Chance Reentry legislation. She passed before I could tell her that the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 that I've been working on for 17 years finally became law, which reduced the 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine. She didn't get a whiff of the winds of change on the horizon. She didn't know that the narrative on crime was shifting and that criminal justice reform was not the lightning rod it was decades earlier. She missed the 2012 Supreme Court ruling Suji and Miller, which held that mandatory life without parole sentences for children violates the 8th Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. She didn't know that the litany of Supreme Court cases in this area, Ron, looked to international law to support its conclusions. Ms. Pearl didn't get to hear that former Attorney General Holder's smart on crime policies focused federal prosecutions on large-scale traffickers rather than big players. She didn't know that President Obama would be the first sitting president to visit a federal prison and starred in a documentary about it. She didn't know about his executive clemency initiative, which I am helping to mobilize to provide relief for those serving inordinately lengthy mandatory minimum sentences. She wasn't around for the bipartisan Senate introduction of perhaps the most comprehensive, progressive federal criminal justice legislation in a generation, and she will be shocked to hear of working alliances between the Koch brothers and the ACLU, Van Jones and Newt Gingrich. It's a new day, people, and a new narrative is being formed. But although Ms. Pearl didn't witness the dawning of this new day and is unable to shape this new narrative, you and I CHH scholars can. We are now at a point where we can openly discuss the data that we have all known for years, that sending people to prison and keeping them there for unconscionably lengthy periods of time does not make us any safer, does not deter future crimes, and does not promote successful reintegration back into our communities. Future lawyers, CHH scholars, we need to find better, more creative, and more cost-effective ways to push the envelope to achieve change. Future lawyers, CHH scholars, we need to raise the ante and have the audacity to advance creative solutions. The Miss Pearls of our community are crying out for you to take your place in continuing the struggle. So in concluding, I want to take just a moment to embellish upon a story Malcolm X often related about two types of enslaved people out there on the plantation back in the day, which he described as the house slave and the field slave. How many of y'all are familiar with that speech? I don't know, the house slave. Okay. Well, in some, he told us that the house slave lived up there in the big house with massa. Actually, it's in the attic or in the basement, but it was in the big house nevertheless. He ate the same food that massa ate, or at least it was the scraps from the crumbs that massa left, but he was satisfied with that. If massa got sick, he said, what? What's the matter, massa? We sick? If massa's house caught fire, he fought harder than massa to put it out. Now the field slave. Malcolm said that he worked in the field from sun up to sundown. He lived in a shack, if that, wore gunny sacks for clothes. When massa got sick, field slave, he prayed they wouldn't recover. When massa's house caught fire, he what? He prayed for that strong wind. But you know what? Malcolm didn't mention another one who was out there on that plantation, the yard hand. You see, the yard hand came from the field, but by hook and crook, he succeeded in getting away from it. Now, the yard hand didn't live in the big house, but she didn't live too far away from it. She was close enough to just look in, peek in. Sometimes got so close she could even sneak right in, Obama. Okay. Now, she didn't live too far from the field either. She could hear the whip of the lash and remember this thing. You see, the yard hand could see what was happening up in the big house. And she could see what was happening in the field. You see, because of this unique position, she often had a choice as to what her position was going to be. Was she going to work in the interests of her people? Check out Sonia Sotomayor's brilliant dissent in the recent Fourth Amendment case. Was she going to work in the interest of her people? Or was she going to work against those interests? Clarence Thomas, who essentially flushed the exclusionary rule down the toilet last week. CHH preparatory law students, the choice the yard hand had yesterday is the exact choice that you as future lawyers of color have today. You have the choice to work against your best interests, or you have the choice to actively promote justice. And this choice is present. Whether your future practice takes you to the apex of the most lucrative law firm in the country or to the most modest legal service provider organization, no matter where your career path takes you, you have the responsibility to put the research, the writing, and the advocacy skills you are learning in the Charles Hamilton Houston Preparatory Law Institute to struggle against injustice in society and to reach back into the community to assist those who never made it out of the field. I would love for you to go into public interest law, but I also would love for you to be a judge. I would love for you to be a prosecutor. I would love for you to be a legislator. I would love for you to be a partner in a huge law firm. Why? Because you might be that judge to finally set Sundiata Acoli and Mumia Abu-Jamal, Ruchell McGee free. You might be that prosecutor who uses her discretion wisely. You might be that legislator who abolishes mandatory minimum penalties. You might be the governor to grant clemency to Assata Shakur. You might be that law firm partner who finances the posting of bail for any Black Lives Matter protester to get out of jail. Perhaps the great orator Frederick Douglass put it best back in 1857 when he explained that the whole progress of human liberty shows that all concessions have been born of what? of earnest struggle. He said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess the favor of freedom, yet depreciate agitation, are those who want the crops without plowing up the ground. They want the rain without the thunder and the lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of his mighty waters. Frederick Douglass said it over 150 years ago, and it still rings strong today, Jordan. Power concedes nothing without a demand in the struggle for justice. It never did and it never will. And that is what I feel being a public interest lawyer, a movement lawyer, a people's lawyer is all about. Picking up that baton from our predecessors and demanding power in our joint struggle for justice. Thank you.
Reception. I just want to say, God bless Nkiji Taifa.
Yeah.
And more importantly to the class, Charles Hamilton Houston lives. Enjoy the reception. Thank you. A few words to say. She's also a member of the class.
I'll keep it short, everybody. I know y'all want to leave, but Mrs. Taifa, thank you so much for your speech today. On behalf of CHH scholars and myself and staff members, professors, we are really, really inspired by the words you told us today. If anything, your speech reaffirmed why we are here and why we chose to study law. And specifically for myself, I'm a reporter in Madison, Wisconsin, and I'll keep this short, everyone, I'm sorry. And I was at a panel one night, and Wisconsin has one of the worst racial disparities in the United States. And a well-known and prominent pastor, lawyer, black man, he's a pastor, he's a lawyer, and he was running to be a judge in the city. He said the reason why so many injustices keep happening is because we are ignorant of the law. And that has really shaped why I have chosen to study law. Specifically, I want to do law that focuses on women's rights, and I have been doing that since. So thank you so much for this day, and I didn't want you to run out of here without me thanking you.
Thank you, Laura.